Hi, and welcome to English with Rick. This lesson is about phrasal verbs, and you might be asking yourself, why do I need to learn about phrasal verbs? I'll give you a bunch of reasons, and one of them is that there are over 5,000 phrasal verbs in English. This means they're used often. The other thing is that they're made up of the most common verbs in English, so learning phrasal verbs gets you familiar with some of the most common regular verbs. However, the meaning of a phrasal verb, or the verb when it's inside a phrasal verb, is different than when it's not in the phrasal verb. If you're going to understand an English speaker, you need to know that. You need to know that the verb meaning has changed when it's outside or inside of a phrasal verb. Also, phrasal verbs can have more than one meaning. So one phrasal verb can mean more than one thing. That all means it's worth paying attention to other people using phrasal verbs and learning about them yourself. A phrasal verb is a normal verb together with an adverb or a preposition, and that adverb or preposition, when it's part of a phrasal verb, is called a particle. It's a normal verb plus a particle. That's a phrasal verb. Together, this makes a phrasal verb, where the meaning of that verb in the phrasal verb is not connected in any way to the meaning of that verb if it was outside the phrasal verb on its own. In a phrasal verb like get over, get normally means to obtain, and over means to be over or to go above something. But together, that becomes a phrasal verb that means to recover from something, which is completely different and totally unrelated to the meaning of that normal verb and that particle that make it up. Basically, it's an idiom in verb form. A lot of the time, you need context to understand what a phrasal verb means. By context, I mean the scene. What's going on around the phrasal verb in a sentence? That clue for context could be in the sentence or in the paragraph or something that's just understood between some people. I'll give you a couple of examples. 1. The plane took off. 2. They took off their jackets. The phrasal verb is took off or take off, and in these two sentences, it could not mean the same thing. But the context of plane in one sentence and jackets in the other helps you understand what took off means. In the first case, it's about the plane, and it's letting you know that the plane is leaving the ground and starting to fly. In the other sentence, the jackets aren't leaving the ground and starting to fly. Probably not, but the jackets are coming off of their bodies. Sometimes a phrasal verb is the most efficient way to express something. In a sentence like, I backed up Susan at work this weekend, there are other ways of saying that, but they may not be as efficient. Another way you could say that is, I was paid to be available this weekend in case Susan could not do all the work. It's a lot easier to say, I backed up Susan at work this weekend. Phrasal verb conjugation and placement is the same as it is for normal verbs, but there are special rules for word order, and that depends on what tense you're using. Looking at 4 tenses, we can see the word placement for get over, the phrasal verb, in these different tenses. First, the past simple tense. Here's an example. I was angry about that last week, but I got over it. In the infinitive form, an example is, he went on vacation to get over his breakup. In the gerund form, a sentence would be like, getting over the flu can take a long time. And for the past participle, here's a sentence, having gotten over their loss, they were ready for the next game. Here's an example of using the phrasal verb get over in the present simple tense. I get over colds and flus quickly. In the past perfect tense, here's a sentence, I have gotten over colds and flus well since I was a child. Notice that the verb get changes just like it would if it was a regular verb outside of the phrasal verb. It would be I get, I got, and I have gotten. It changes the same way as it does outside a phrasal verb and in, but the particle doesn't change. There are two pair types of phrasal verbs, transitive and intransitive, that's one pair. Separable and inseparable is the other pair. And any phrasal verb can only belong to one type within each pair. It can only be transitive or intransitive. It can't be separable and inseparable at the same time. Let's look at transitive, intransitive, separable, and inseparable phrasal verbs in more detail. These phrasal verb types. Transitive phrasal verbs need or use a direct object. In a sentence like, I couldn't cheer Karen up, the phrasal verb affects the direct object, Karen. The phrasal verb is cheer up, and it needs to have some kind of an object that it affects. That is Karen. Intransitive phrasal verbs do not require an object. In a sentence like, the employees never would come around, the phrasal verb is come around, and it means to convince somebody to start thinking like you do, or for someone to start seeing the correct way of doing something, or something like that. It means that the phrasal verb doesn't have a direct effect on something or someone. For separable phrasal verbs, the direct object can be put between the verb and the particle. That means you can separate the two pieces, the verb and the particle. In a sentence like, I'll pick you up after work, you can take the direct object and put it right in the middle of the phrasal verb and separate the two pieces, the verb and the particle. You, the direct object, can go between pick and up in the phrasal verb pick up because it's separable. For inseparable phrasal verbs, the verb and the particle have to stay together always. In a sentence like, shut down your PC at the end of the day, you can't take shut and down and separate those words and put something in between them like you could with a separable phrasal verb. Unfortunately, you have to memorize which phrasal verbs are separable and which are not. An example of a separable phrasal verb is set up. So you can say, would you please set up the game? You can also say, would you please set the game up? Both of these are correct. That's some of the information about phrasal verbs. There's more in the full lesson on Patreon, and you can support me on Patreon if you can. If you can't, I hope you learn lots from these lessons. Until next time.